Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you heartfelt tales of love, redemption, and the profound lessons life has to offer. Today's story takes you into the world of Charlotte Reed, a young woman caught in an arranged engagement with the charming yet flawed Elliot Carter. What begins as a tale of betrayal and heartbreak transforms into a journey of self-discovery, second chances, and the courage to rewrite one's destiny. Don't miss this captivating story that will leave you inspired and hopeful. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story with Life Stories. Let's dive in. The morning air carried a crisp chill as Charlotte Reed fastened the last clasp on her pearl necklace. Her reflection stared back at her from the gilded mirror, an image of poise and perfection that masked the storm brewing within. This was not a day of celebration, though it should have been. Engagements, in most lives, marked the beginning of a joyful union. But for Charlotte, it felt like shackles tightening around her freedom. She stepped away from the mirror and grabbed a manila folder from her desk. Inside were photographs, texts, and receipts, all meticulously gathered evidence of Elliot Carter's infidelity. Charlotte's lips tightened as she flipped through them, each piece a reminder of the lies woven into her life. She had no illusions about love in an arranged marriage. But betrayal? That was a line she would not tolerate. The engagement between her and Elliot wasn't her choice. Their families had orchestrated it, an alliance of power between the Reeds of Los Angeles and the Carters of New York City. From the moment the arrangement was announced, Charlotte had resolved to play her part. But Elliot's actions had given her the perfect out. Her plan was simple. Present the evidence to her family, force their hand to cancel the engagement, and reclaim her autonomy. Charlotte's resolve solidified when her phone buzzed. It was Grace Monroe, her closest friend since childhood. Grace, sharp-witted and loyal, had agreed to infiltrate the Carter household as a maid, a bold and risky move designed to gather insights from the inside. Charlotte trusted her completely, knowing that Grace's fierce determination rivaled her own. "It's done," Grace said when Charlotte answered. Her voice, though calm, carried a note of triumph. "I've settled in. No one suspects a thing." "Good. Keep an eye on Elliot. We need as much as we can get before I present this to father," Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. She couldn't afford to falter now. Grace chuckled softly. "He's already noticed me. He's not used to people standing up to him, even in small ways. I think he's suspicious. But nothing I can't handle." Charlotte smiled for the first time that morning. "You're a lifesaver, Grace. Just remember, you owe me dinner at that fancy French place when this is over," Grace quipped before hanging up. Charlotte stared at the folder again, her fingers tightening around its edges. The thought of facing her father, a man known for his unyielding demeanor, sent a ripple of anxiety through her. The Reed patriarch was not someone easily swayed, especially when family alliances were at stake. But Charlotte was determined. This wasn't just about ending the engagement, it was about reclaiming her future. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Charlotte found herself pacing her opulent room. Her mother had insisted on hosting the engagement dinner at their Los Angeles estate, an affair designed to dazzle the Carters and cement their alliance. The thought of Elliot smiling across the table, pretending to care, made her stomach churn. Her phone buzzed again, Grace. This time with a photo attached. It was a blurry image of Elliot in what appeared to be a dimly lit lounge, his arm draped around a woman Charlotte didn't recognize. The caption read, "Caught him red-handed." Again. Charlotte's grip tightened on the phone. Each piece of evidence was another step closer to freedom. But it also deepened her anger. How dare he? The gall of flaunting his indiscretions while expecting her to play the dutiful fiancé was almost laughable. The dinner arrived, bringing with it the suffocating presence of expectations and veiled judgments. The dining hall shimmered with crystal chandeliers and the hum of polite conversation. Charlotte played her part impeccably, offering smiles and nods as needed. But her mind was elsewhere. Elliot sat across from her, His charm turned up to full volume as he entertained their families. She studied him, searching for a crack in his facade. But he was as polished as ever. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts. "Charlotte. Elliot mentioned you've been busy preparing for the wedding. How's it coming along?" Charlotte felt the weight of all eyes on her. "It's coming together," she replied smoothly, "though I think there's always room for improvement." Elliot's gaze flicked to her. A brief moment of curiosity in his otherwise composed expression. It was the first time she'd seen him unsure, even for a second. And it fueled her resolve. Let him wonder, she thought. As the evening wound down, Charlotte excused herself. Retreating to her room, the folder lay waiting for her on the desk, its contents a silent reminder of the battle ahead. She called Grace once more, needing the reassurance of her friend's unwavering confidence. "How's it going on your end?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Smooth so far," Grace replied. "Though there's someone you might need to watch out for, Olivia Hayes. She's close to Elliot. And she seems territorial." Charlotte frowned. The name was familiar, but only vaguely. Territorial how? "Let's just say she doesn't like competition, even when it's imagined." "I'll keep an eye on her," Grace said. Charlotte nodded, though Grace couldn't see it. "Be careful. The last thing we need is for you to get caught. Don't worry about me. Focus on your plan. We'll get through this." When the call ended, Charlotte sat in silence, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. The path she'd chosen wasn't easy, but she knew it was the right one. She wouldn't be trapped in a loveless, dishonest marriage, not for family, not for tradition, not for anything. As she prepared for bed, Charlotte allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, staring at the stars outside her window. She whispered a quiet promise to herself. "I'll make it out of this, no matter what." The next morning dawned bright and unrelenting, the Los Angeles sun cutting through the thin curtains of Charlotte's room. She awoke with a sense of purpose and trepidation. Today, the wheels of her plan would be set fully in motion. Her family, deeply rooted in tradition and power, had rarely been swayed by emotions or personal desires. Charlotte needed to present her case with precision, leaving no room for doubt. Across town, Grace Monroe was adjusting her new uniform, a plain black dress with a white apron, blending seamlessly into the Carter household as a maid. It had taken weeks to arrange her placement, and every detail had been calculated. Grace's natural intelligence and unassuming charm had already begun to earn her a place in the sprawling Carter mansion. For Charlotte, Grace was more than a friend, she was the linchpin of this entire operation. Grace moved through the grand halls of the Carter estate with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where they belonged, even if no one else did. She had spent her first 2 days carefully observing the rhythms of the house, noting who came and went, and most importantly, how Elliot Carter operated within his domain. Despite his polished exterior, it was clear he enjoyed his position of power and the privileges it afforded him. Her interactions with Elliot were limited at first, consisting of polite exchanges when their paths crossed. But Grace's sharp wit occasionally surfaced, drawing a flicker of amusement or suspicion from him. She was careful not to overplay her hand, just enough to pique his interest without revealing her true purpose. On her 3rd day, she found herself in the library, dusting the shelves when Elliot entered. He carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to being admired, his tailored suit immaculate and his presence commanding. "I didn't know the library needed such meticulous care," he said, his tone light but curious. Grace glanced over her shoulder, her hand stilling for a moment on the duster. Books hold more dust than secrets, but both can be telling if you look closely enough. Elliot raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You speak as though you've read every book in here." "Not every book, but enough to know which ones are worth the dust," Grace replied, her tone even. Elliot studied her for a moment longer before turning to the shelves, selecting a book at random. "And which ones would you consider worth my time?" Grace hesitated, then allowed herself a small smile. That depends. Are you looking to learn something new or simply reinforce what you already believe? The question hung in the air for a moment, and Elliot's lips curved into a faint smile. I'll keep that in mind. With that, he left, leaving Grace to her work, but not before casting a curious glance over his shoulder. Meanwhile, Charlotte's strategy outside the Carter estate was unfolding with equal precision. She had begun sending anonymous messages to her parents, slipping fragments of Elliot's indiscretions into their carefully managed world. Her first attempt, a photograph of Elliot with another woman, along with a scathing note, had been dismissed as a possible fabrication. But Charlotte knew persistence was key. She mailed her next package directly to her father, this time including receipts and text message screenshots, each detail meticulously documented. Her father, a man of unshakable pragmatism, valued hard evidence above all else. If she could convince him, the rest of her family would follow suit. Charlotte's mother, on the other hand, was a different challenge. For her, appearances were paramount. The marriage was not just an alliance but a spectacle, a grand display of wealth and influence. Charlotte knew that unraveling her mother's expectations would require a more personal touch. She began planting seeds of doubt during their conversations, subtly steering the topic toward the importance of trust and integrity in a marriage. Despite her outward composure, the strain of Charlotte's plan began to weigh on her. She found herself questioning the ethics of her methods, even as she reminded herself of Elliot's betrayal. The stakes were high not just for her, but for Grace, whose position in the Carter household became increasingly precarious as time passed. One evening, Grace called Charlotte with an update. "He's starting to notice me more," she said, her voice low and measured. "Not in a bad way, though. I think he finds it refreshing that I don't fawn over him like everyone else." Charlotte frowned. "That's not necessarily good news. If he gets too interested, it could complicate things." "I can handle it," Grace assured her. "But there's something else. He mentioned Olivia Hayes today. She's coming over tomorrow." The name sent a chill through Charlotte. Olivia was Elliot's childhood friend, a woman who had always hovered around him like a shadow. Her interest in Elliot was no secret, and her disdain for anyone who threatened her position was equally well known. "Be careful," Charlotte warned. "Olivia's not the kind of person who takes kindly to competition." Grace laughed softly. "Competition? I'm just a maid in his house." "Exactly," Charlotte replied. "And Olivia won't see it that way." The next day, Grace prepared for Olivia's arrival with a mix of curiosity and caution. She moved through her tasks with precision, keeping an ear out for the sound of high heels clicking against the marble floors. When Olivia finally appeared, her presence was as commanding as Charlotte had warned: tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating confidence. Grace maintained her composure, offering a polite smile as she passed by. But Olivia's sharp eyes followed her, and Grace could feel the weight of her scrutiny. It was clear that Olivia saw her as more than just a servant, and Grace knew it was only a matter of time before that suspicion turned into action. Back in Los Angeles, Charlotte received another call from Grace. "Olivia's here, and she's already watching me," Grace reported. "Stay alert," Charlotte said, her voice firm. "We're getting closer to the endgame. Just hold on a little longer." As she hung up, Charlotte felt a mix of determination and dread. The pieces were moving into place, but the risks were growing with each step. For better or worse, there was no turning back now. The Carter estate buzzed with life the day Olivia Hayes arrived. Her presence was as dramatic as the flourish of her arrival, a sleek black car pulling into the grand driveway, her heels clicking on the polished marble floors as if announcing her dominance. Olivia embodied elegance and confidence, a woman who commanded attention without asking for it. She was the type who didn't just walk into a room, she took possession of it. Grace Monroe watched from the shadows, her movements deliberately quiet as she dusted a vase in the hallway. From her vantage point, she could see Olivia greeting Elliot with a warm embrace, her laughter ringing out like a bell. The ease between them was palpable. And Grace could tell that Olivia wasn't just an old friend, she was someone who believed she had a claim to Elliot. "Who's that?" a fellow maid whispered to Grace as they worked. "Olivia Hayes," Grace replied in a hushed tone, keeping her eyes on the interaction. "Childhood friend of Mr. Carter. And trouble." Grace had barely spoken the words when Olivia's sharp gaze flicked in her direction, her bright green eyes narrowing slightly. It was as though she could sense the conversation. Even from across the room, Grace quickly averted her eyes, focusing on her task. She had no intention of drawing attention to herself, not yet. At least. Later that day, Grace's duties brought her into the sitting room where Olivia and Elliot were enjoying tea. Grace worked in silence, her presence barely acknowledged, until Olivia decided otherwise. "You," Olivia called out, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Grace turned slowly, schooling her expression into one of polite deference. "Yes." She replied. Olivia's gaze was piercing, her smile saccharine. "I couldn't help but notice how you've been flitting around like a little ghost." "What's your name?" "Grace." She answered evenly. "Well, Grace," Olivia said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Be sure to clean the corners properly. I've noticed some dust. And I'd hate for Elliot to think his home is anything less than pristine." Grace's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Of course. I'll see to it right away." As Grace left the room, she could feel Elliot's eyes on her. Though he said nothing, Olivia's attempt to assert dominance was expected. But it still stung. Grace reminded herself that she had a mission, and petty jabs from Olivia were nothing compared to what was at stake. The real trouble began a few days later. Grace had just finished polishing the silver in the dining room when she heard raised voices from the hallway. She peeked around the corner to see Olivia holding a delicate bracelet, her expression a mix of fury and triumph. "This was in her room," Olivia declared, her voice loud enough to draw a crowd of onlookers, including Elliot and several other staff members. "I can't believe you'd hire a thief." "Elliot." Grace's stomach dropped. She recognized the bracelet, it was one Olivia had been wearing the day she arrived. The accusation was clear, and Grace knew it was a calculated move. Olivia had planted the bracelet in her room to discredit her. Elliot's expression darkened as he turned to Grace. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Grace met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. I didn't take it." Olivia scoffed. Of course she'd deny it. Thieves always do. She probably thought she could sell it and no one would notice. "I didn't take it," Grace repeated firmly, her hands clenched at her sides. But she kept her tone measured. "I've never stolen anything in my life." The room fell silent as everyone waited for Elliot's response. To Grace's surprise, he turned to Olivia instead. "How do you know it was in her room?" he asked, his voice calm but cold. Olivia faltered, her confidence wavering for the first time. I overheard one of the maids saying they saw her acting suspicious. So I checked myself. It's hardly uncommon for people like her to." "People like her?" Elliot cut her off, his tone sharp. "Grace has worked here without incident. You, on the other hand, have no authority to search anyone's room, let alone accuse my staff without proof." Olivia's face flushed with indignation. "I was trying to help you, Elliot. I thought you'd want to know if someone was stealing from you." Elliot's gaze hardened. "Next time, leave the investigating to me. Grace stays." The tension in the room was palpable as Olivia reluctantly handed the bracelet to Elliot and stormed out. Grace stood frozen, stunned by what had just happened. Elliot had defended her, something she hadn't expected. Once the crowd dispersed, Elliot turned to Grace. "I'll look into this," he said quietly. "If you're telling the truth, you have nothing to worry about." "Thank you," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. As she returned to her duties, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Elliot's defense of her wasn't just about fairness. There was something deeper in his eyes, a flicker of trust. Or perhaps curiosity. She knew better than to read too much into it. But the moment lingered in her mind. Back in her small room that evening, Grace called Charlotte to update her on the day's events. "Olivia tried to frame me," she said bluntly. "But Elliot defended me." Charlotte was silent for a moment before speaking. "That's unexpected. Maybe he's not as heartless as we thought. Or maybe he just doesn't like Olivia overstepping her bounds." Grace replied. "Either way, it's a small victory." But both women knew the battle was far from over. Olivia was not the type to back down easily, and Grace's presence in the Carter household had become more precarious than ever. Yet, as she lay awake that night, Grace found herself strangely emboldened. If Elliot's trust could be earned, perhaps Charlotte's plan had more hope than either of them had dared to believe. The morning after Olivia's dramatic accusation, the Carter household seemed to have returned to its usual rhythm. But Grace Monroe knew better. The calm was deceptive, the kind that came before the storm. Olivia's failed attempt to frame her had set a chain of events into motion, and Grace was sure it was only a matter of time before the storm broke. As Grace polished the silverware in the dining room, she overheard Elliot's voice drifting through the open door of his study. He was on the phone, his tone calm but firm. "I don't care what Olivia said. It's not her place to interfere," Elliot said, a note of irritation creeping into his voice. "I'll deal with it myself." Grace's ears pricked up, but she forced herself to focus on her task. It was clear that Elliot wasn't entirely swayed by Olivia's theatrics, but she couldn't count on his continued support. Every moment she stayed in the Carter household increased the risk of exposure, not just for herself, but for Charlotte's carefully orchestrated plan. Later that evening, Grace found herself in the library again, tidying up the shelves. She had grown fond of the space. It was quieter than the rest of the house and gave her time to think. She was lost in her thoughts when Elliot walked in, his presence as commanding as ever. "You seem to spend a lot of time in here," he remarked, his voice breaking the silence. Grace turned to face him, her expression neutral. "It's a peaceful place, and there's always work to be done." Elliot studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "You're not like the other staff," he said finally. "There's something different about you." Grace's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her composure. "I'm just here to do my job, sir." "Is that so?" he asked, his tone laced with curiosity. "Then why do I get the feeling you're hiding something?" Grace met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch. "Everyone has their secrets, Mr. Carter." Elliot chuckled softly, the sound low and unexpectedly warm. "Fair enough," he said, turning his attention to the shelves. But the moment lingered, a quiet tension stretching between them. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, Charlotte Reed was preparing for her next move. The evidence she had sent to her father was beginning to have an impact. Her father, ever the pragmatist, had called her into his study for a private conversation. "Charlotte," he began, his tone measured, "I received some troubling information about Elliot. Is there something you want to tell me?" Charlotte took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Yes, father. Elliot has been unfaithful. I've been gathering evidence to prove it." Her father's expression darkened. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "I wanted to be sure," Charlotte replied. "I know how important this alliance is to you, but I can't marry someone I can't trust." Her father was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her. Finally, he nodded. "If what you say is true, this engagement cannot continue. But you'll need to present your case to the entire family. The Carters will demand answers, and we must be prepared." Charlotte felt a surge of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the hardest part was yet to come. She would have to confront not just Elliot, but his entire family. The thought of standing in front of them, exposing the truth, filled her with both dread and determination. Back at the Carter estate, Grace's position was growing more precarious. Olivia had taken to watching her closely, her suspicion evident in every glance. It was only a matter of time before she made another move. The confrontation came sooner than Grace expected. It happened during a dinner party hosted by the Carters, an event designed to impress their wealthy and influential friends. Grace had been assigned to serve drinks, her role keeping her in the background until Olivia decided otherwise. As Grace passed by Olivia's table, carrying a tray of champagne flutes, Olivia reached out and deliberately tipped the tray, sending the glasses crashing to the floor. The room fell silent as everyone turned to see what had happened. "Clumsy, aren't we?" Olivia said, her voice dripping with mockery. "It's no wonder things keep going missing around here." Grace's cheeks burned, but she refused to rise to the bait. She knelt to pick up the shattered glass, her movements calm and deliberate. Before she could respond, Elliot's voice cut through the silence. "Enough, Olivia." All eyes turned to him as he rose from his seat, his expression cold. "This is not the time or place for petty accusations. Grace is a valued member of this household, and I won't tolerate her being treated like this." Olivia's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing. Grace glanced up at Elliot, her gratitude evident, though she quickly looked away. The next day, Charlotte arrived at the Carter estate unannounced. She was dressed impeccably, her presence commanding as she walked into the grand foyer. Elliot, who had just returned from a meeting, looked up in surprise. "Charlotte," he said, his tone cautious. "I wasn't expecting you." "We need to talk," she replied, her voice steady. "In private." Elliot led her to his study, closing the door behind them. Charlotte wasted no time, placing the folder of evidence on his desk. "I know everything," she said, her tone cold. "And so does my family. The engagement is off." Elliot's eyes widened as he opened the folder, his expression darkening with every page. "Charlotte, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," she interrupted. "You've lied, cheated, and humiliated me. This arrangement is over." Elliot stared at her, his jaw tight. "You don't understand the full story." "I don't need to," Charlotte replied, her voice firm. "This is my decision, and it's final." With that, she turned and walked out, her head held high. The weight that had been pressing down on her for months began to lift, replaced by a sense of liberation. For the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt in control of her own destiny. But as she stepped into the cool evening air, she couldn't shake the feeling that the story was far from over. The days following Charlotte's confrontation with Elliot were a whirlwind of decisions and emotions. The engagement had been formally called off, leaving the Reed family in a storm of whispers and debates about what the fallout might mean. Her father had stood by her, as promised, and the alliance with the Carter family was dissolved. For Charlotte, it was a bittersweet victory. She had fought for her independence and won, but the scars of the ordeal lingered. Her 22nd birthday arrived amid this turbulent time. Her family insisted on throwing a grand party at their Los Angeles estate, a gesture of solidarity and celebration for their eldest daughter. The event was as extravagant as ever, a glittering affair with guests from their social circle, live music, and endless champagne. Yet Charlotte couldn't help but feel disconnected from the opulence. She smiled politely, laughed when expected, but her heart remained heavy. Grace, who had returned to the Reeds after completing her part in the plan, stayed by Charlotte's side for much of the evening. They had grown even closer through their shared ordeal, and Grace understood better than anyone what Charlotte had endured. "I think it's time for you to enjoy your night," Grace said, nudging her friend gently. "Let go of the past. If only for tonight." Charlotte smiled faintly. Easier said than done. Grace was about to reply when the sound of a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Charlotte turned, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Elliot Carter standing in the doorway, holding a bouquet of deep red roses. His presence was a sharp contrast to the light-hearted atmosphere of the party, and the room seemed to quiet as he approached. "What is he doing here?" Grace whispered, her tone laced with suspicion. "I have no idea," Charlotte replied, her voice barely audible. Elliot stopped a few steps away from her, his expression unreadable. "Charlotte," he began, his voice low but firm, "I know I'm the last person you want to see tonight. But I need to speak with you. Please." The weight of his presence, coupled with the curious stares of the guests, made it impossible for Charlotte to refuse. She nodded curtly and led him to a quieter corner of the garden, away from prying eyes. "What do you want, Elliot?" she asked, crossing her arms as she turned to face him. "If you're here to argue or make excuses, you're wasting your time." Elliot held out the roses, his gaze steady. "I'm not here to argue. I came to apologize." Charlotte hesitated before taking the bouquet, though her expression remained guarded. "Go on, then." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair. "I know I've been a fool. I didn't treat you the way you deserved. And I let my arrogance blind me to what was right in front of me. You were always more than just a piece in our family's alliance. But I didn't realize it until it was too late." Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Elliot continued, his tone earnest. "You were right to call off the engagement. I needed to be held accountable for my actions, and I respect your decision. But I also want you to know that I've changed. Losing you made me see how much I took for granted, and I'm determined to be better, not for my family, not for appearances, but for myself." Charlotte studied him carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I still care about you," Elliot admitted. "And I know it's too soon to ask for a second chance. But I'd like to at least be your friend. To prove that I can be someone worthy of your trust." The sincerity in his voice caught Charlotte off guard. 4 months. She had thought of Elliot as nothing more than a charming liar. But now, he seemed different. Still, she wasn't ready to forgive him so easily. "Friendship," she said slowly. "That's all you're asking for?" "For now," Elliot replied. "I won't pressure you for anything more. I just want the chance to show you who I really am." Charlotte hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Finally, she nodded. "Fine. But don't expect me to make this easy for you." A small smile tugged at the corner of Elliot's mouth. "I wouldn't dream of it." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Elliot stayed at the party, keeping his distance but occasionally catching Charlotte's eye across the room. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a fragile truce that might one day grow into something stronger. As the night wore on, Charlotte found herself watching him more than she expected. He was polite, even charming, with the guests. But there was a quiet humility in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. It was as if he was trying to prove, not just to her, but to himself, that he could be better. When the party finally ended, and the last guests had departed, Charlotte retreated to her room. She placed the roses in a vase by the window, their rich color standing out against the pale moonlight. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Elliot could change. Perhaps they could both find a way to move forward, not as fiancés, but as two people trying to navigate the complexities of love, trust, and redemption. Only time would tell. The days following Charlotte's birthday were filled with an odd, simmering tension. Elliot Carter's surprise appearance at her party had stirred emotions she wasn't prepared to confront. Though she had agreed to his request for friendship, Charlotte remained cautious. She had spent months convincing herself that her future with Elliot was a mistake. And now he was trying to rewrite their narrative. Could someone so deeply flawed truly change? Grace, ever the perceptive confidant, noticed the shift in Charlotte's demeanor. They were seated in the sunlit garden one morning, sipping tea as the crisp winter air carried the faint scent of blooming roses. "So, are you going to tell me what's on your mind?" Grace asked, her tone light but probing. Charlotte sighed, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "It's Elliot. I don't know what to make of him anymore. He's been different." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Quieter. Thoughtful. Less self-assured. But in a good way." Charlotte admitted reluctantly. "It's like he's actually trying to be a better person." Grace studied her friend carefully. "And how does that make you feel?" Charlotte hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Confused. Angry. But also curious. I don't want to forgive him. But part of me wonders if I should." Grace smiled knowingly. "You don't have to decide anything right now. Let him prove himself. Actions speak louder than words." Charlotte nodded, grateful for Grace's steady presence. But the uncertainty lingered, a quiet ache she couldn't ignore. A week later, Charlotte received an invitation to a charity gala hosted by the Carter family. She had initially planned to decline, not wanting to wade back into the world of high society with its forced smiles and whispered judgments. But Elliot's name at the bottom of the invitation gave her pause. He was extending an olive branch, a chance to see him in a different light. Against her better judgment, she decided to go. The gala was as extravagant as she had expected, held in a grand ballroom with towering crystal chandeliers and tables adorned with gold accents. Charlotte arrived in a sleek emerald gown, her presence turning heads as she stepped into the room. She scanned the crowd, her heart skipping a beat when she spotted Elliot near the stage. He looked different, still impeccably dressed. But his usual air of arrogance was replaced by something softer. "Charlotte." Elliot greeted her warmly when she approached. His eyes lingered on her, admiration evident in his gaze. "Thank you for coming." "I wasn't sure if I would," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "But I'm here. Let's see what you've planned." Elliot smiled, gesturing toward the stage. "Tonight's about supporting local shelters. We're raising money to provide education and resources for underprivileged children." Charlotte blinked, caught off guard. The old Elliot would have used a gala like this as a networking opportunity or a chance to show off his wealth. This felt genuine. As the night unfolded, Charlotte found herself watching Elliot more closely. He mingled with the guests, not out of obligation but with a sincere interest in their stories. He gave a speech that was heartfelt and humble, emphasizing the importance of giving back to the community. It was a side of him she had never seen before, and it unsettled her. During a lull in the evening, Elliot found her on the balcony overlooking the city. The cool breeze carried the distant hum of traffic as they stood in comfortable silence. "You've changed," Charlotte said finally, her voice quiet but firm. Elliot turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I hope so. Losing you made me realize how much I needed to." Charlotte looked at him, her emotions swirling. "Why does it matter so much to you?" "We were an arrangement, Elliot. Nothing more." "That's what I thought, too," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "But somewhere along the way, it became more than that for me. I just didn't realize it until I'd already messed everything up." His honesty caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She looked out at the city lights, their glow reflecting the turmoil inside her. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You hurt me, Elliot. And I don't think I've forgiven you for that. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight." Elliot replied, "But I'm willing to spend as much time as it takes proving that I'm not the man I used to be." Charlotte turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "And what if I don't want to give you that chance?" Elliot smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "Then I'll respect that. But I'll still try." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of music drifting from inside. Someone had started a game of truth or dare, and the guests were laughing as they took turns challenging one another. To Charlotte's surprise, Elliot offered his hand. "May I have this dance?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated, then placed her hand in his. They stepped inside, the room buzzing with energy as they joined the other couples on the dance floor. As they moved to the rhythm of the music, Charlotte felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. In that moment, she realized that life wasn't about clean breaks or perfect endings. It was messy and complicated, full of mistakes and second chances. Whether she and Elliot had a future together remained uncertain. But for now, she was willing to take one small step forward. And sometimes, that was enough. As the final notes of the music faded, Charlotte and Elliot found themselves standing still amidst the swirling crowd, the world seeming to pause around them. Their journey had been anything but simple, a story of betrayal, redemption, and newfound understanding. Charlotte looked up at Elliot, her emotions a mixture of lingering doubt and cautious hope. He had changed. She could see that now. But trust would take time. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of possibility. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, "but I think I'm ready to take it one step at a time." Elliot's smile was gentle, devoid of his usual bravado. "That's all I could ever hope for." As they stepped back into the crowd, the glow of the evening wrapped around them like a warm embrace. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real. And sometimes, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more heartfelt tales filled with love, redemption, and life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for new videos from Life Stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.